Hi, Yinnies, and welcome back to a Yin Yoga podcast. If you're new around here, welcome. If you are a return listener, welcome back. It's lovely to have you here again. If we haven't met before, my name is Nick Danu. I am a yoga therapist, a Yin Yoga teacher trainer, a yoga business mentor. I help yoga teachers with their businesses. And of course, I also teach the general public. That's about me in a nutshell. And today we have a guest interview, which I'm doing a little bit differently than how I've done guest interviews in the past. Typically speaking, when we do guest interviews, I get their whole origin story, we talk about the topic, and then we do some sort of icebreaker questions at the end. And the reason that I'm doing this one differently, and I have a feeling there'll be a couple more like this, is because of the connection that I made with today's guest. Dr. Karinas Smith, and she reached out to me on Instagram because she had heard some of the episodes and just wanted to kind of connect and touch base and nerd out about yin and TCM and some of these things. And because that even banter back and forth with her and I in Instagram messages was so good, and then we met on Zoom and just had like a chat and just two colleagues kind of chatting it up, I realized that I think the best way for me to have her on the podcast was to have a little bit more of what I would call like a fireside chat. So, yes, we're going to hear about Karina's yoga journey and things like that, but there's a lot more of her and I kind of going back and forth. It's more conversational than interview style. And the reason that I wanted to do this is because when we had these connections on Instagram and then when we met on Zoom, it just felt like the conversations were so good and so rich and so nuanced. And there was so much there that I just kept wanting to hit record. And so this time we hit record. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Karina Smith, but I also just wanted to plant the seed that this conversation is very rich and layered, and it is more conversational. And that there's so much here that I'm actually not sure what I'm going to call it yet, and I may have trouble naming this one. But yes, it's a long format interview, and I hope that you enjoy it. I'll just tell you a little bit about who I'm chatting with today. So Dr. Karina Smith is a Melbourne-based yin yoga teacher trainer and qualified acupuncturist. She's been studying yin yoga since 2018 and is extremely passionate about spreading this. Sorry, she's been training yin yoga teachers since 2018. I misspoke there. And is extremely passionate about spreading the word of skeletal variations into the wider yoga community. She runs a home clinic where she supports her patients using classical acupuncture, herbal medicine, and lifestyle and diet advice. And over the years, she's been facilitating yin yoga trainings and administering acupuncture treatments. She's been getting really clear on the ways that yin yoga and Chinese medicine intersect and also where they don't. Her current passion is to keep yin yoga and Chinese medicine clearly in their own lanes and encouraging teachers to only include Chinese medicine information in their classes where it's actually relevant and useful to the student's experience. We go over this in depth in this episode. Not to overload the precious yin yoga space with unnecessary information and talking. Karina runs annual in-person trainings in Melbourne, a suite of free yin yoga classes online, and has a variety of on-demand courses all available on her website, which of course will be linked in the show notes. Okay, so that's a little bit about Karina, and I hope that you enjoy this episode. Coming up, I feel like this conversation was very rich and very layered, and really, I feel like not one to miss. So when you hear from me next, I'll be with Karina. Enjoy. Hi, Karina. Welcome to a Yin Yoga podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited about this. So those of you that are regular listeners, this episode will still have some of the same framework of a guest interview, but it's also going to be a little bit more what I'm thinking of as like a fireside chat between two professionals with similar trainings and backgrounds that both offer yin trainings, and just kind of some things that we've noticed and some quandaries that we've had and some thoughts and things that have worked and haven't worked. So this will be a little bit of sort of like a sneak peek behind the curtain, kind of a conversation. I often think of these as like, in the Wizard of Oz, where you like pull back the curtain and you're like, oh, that's what's going on back there. So it'll be a bit of an interesting episode, I think, for that reason. But I do definitely still want to get your origin story, both for yoga and for TCM, for traditional Chinese medicine. So let's start with like, when did you find yoga?
Sure. I have a background in performance and dance. So from a really young girl, I was doing ballet classes and stage performance, and that carried through my whole teenage years. And then I decided I would continue that at university, and I enrolled in a dance degree, which was fabulous. And I loved it. It was theatre making and contemporary dance, and I had my full art kind of fantasy come to life. And there was a little bit of yoga sprinkled into that in some of the dance teachers' warm-ups, which was interesting and curious. But it probably wasn't until I was finished that degree and trying to make art and struggle as an artist and figure out if that was my path, that I was quite burned out and exhausted. And I found a little flyer in my letterbox for a yoga studio. And I thought, ooh, 7-day trial, that might be nice. I'm going to check that out. And I just loved it. And I loved it because it gave me this refuge of, oh, I get to do things with my body that don't have a performative outcome, and it's just for me. And it doesn't have this, goal at the end where I have to present something for others. It's something just for me. And the introspection of that, and the rest that I received from that, I just fell in love with it. It's great. And it wasn't too long after that at that same studio, I did my first yoga teacher training.
Oh,
Because they
nice.
offered it.
So what style of yoga was your first experience in?
It was a studio that offered a lot of different classes, but I would say the very first class I went to, it might have been listed as a beginner's class. It would have just been a nice, gentle hatha class. And it was in the evening and there were candles lit. And I thought,
Oh, lovely.
oh, I need this. This is great.
Yeah, my first was also a sort of gentle beginner hatha, and I had the same experience. I was just like, oh my God, yoga forever. Like, this is amazing. Yeah. And so then you practiced there for a while, then you took their teacher training as your first training?
Yes.
Nice.
Yes, they were offering a year-long program, which is quite rare now to do a year-long program. Now they're sort of a couple of weeks in Bali, maybe, or a few months. And that was lovely. So one night a week, you would come for your lecture, and then you would have that whole week to digest, and you'd be doing classes, and it was wonderful. Back when a 350-hour was quite standard. And I actually ended up becoming one of their lecturers there. So fast forward a few years, when I was doing a lot more deep study with yin yoga and learning about skeletal variation, I became their anatomy teacher and their yin teacher, and I did some meditation lectures as well. So there was this beautiful growth from dropping in for a class that I found on a pamphlet in my letterbox to then becoming one of their staff, which was a wonderful chapter.
Couple of things I want to tease out there a bit more. So you, what year was this that you took your first class, and then kind of your first training, if you remember? If you don't, just, a general idea.
I think it was 2007. I will add in that before that, more for an athletic type A attraction perspective, I had done a couple of Bikram intro passes, but this was so different. I don't really see them as being the same. So yeah, that was about 2007.
Cool.
When I started.
It's interesting that you said that your first program was a year, and then it was like spread out, and then it was 350. So once again, we mirror each other well. My first program was a 300-hour spread out over a year and a half. I think it was every second weekend. If I remember correctly, it was a while ago. And then we would also have, of course, we would go to the studio and we would have workshops and we'd have classes and stuff. And one of the things I loved about that model of it being stretched out is, like you said, it gives you that time to take these teachings and now chew on them and practice them in your life and in your practice. And, with both the asana, but also just the philosophy, and then just kind of like to really allow the things to start to settle in, as opposed to an intensive model where things are really like crammed together. It's like you're just literally pulling in words, and you don't have the time for anything to kind of steep into your bones, and to be able to kind of make it your own and understand it in your own way, and be able to like speak to it in that way. And I think that mine also had some mentorship, which also I think is seriously lacking in yoga trainings. I think it's really unfortunate that now we have this sort of 200-hour model. I don't think it's nearly enough time. That's probably a rant for another time. But also that within that model, that people are condensing things into these, like you said, like you go to Bali for 2 weeks and now you're a yoga teacher. It's like, whoa, so much of being a teacher and being able to speak to your students comes from your own lived, felt experience with the practices. And if you get everything so smushed together, it's no wonder that so many new teachers I talk to say universally they come out and they don't feel ready to teach. And maybe some of that is, some of them maybe wouldn't, even after a longer training with mentorship, because it's just who they are as people. But I really do think that if it's a longer training, you have so much more time to absorb the material, to let it kind of really seep into you and understand it and get mentorship. You're so much better prepared for now starting to try to get classes.
Agreed. And part of that for me, when I was doing the year-long training, was I lived in this really cool big warehouse with my housemates, and I had the luxury of a little space downstairs that was sort of my dance studio, where I would do improvisation and stretch and do practice, but I would have a weekly yoga class with friends, about 4 or 5 people, that would just sort of drop in. And it meant that as I was doing the training, I got a chance to embody what I was learning, get feedback from people whilst I had mentorship there. And that did set me apart a little bit, because I felt very confident and ready to teach as soon as I had completed the year. But as you say, there were a bunch of people in my cohort that still didn't feel ready, even though they'd had a year of immersing and practice teaching and guidance. And so, yeah, the people that are doing it in 5 weeks or even 2 or 3 months, there's a lot of pressure. It's quite a big gap to step over to then feel ready to teach in a public studio.
Yeah, almost like a chasm from like one cliff to another. Like it's huge. There's no bridge there to say, okay, now you've finished. Here's where we go slowly to get to here. Yeah. I loved that you were like, I'm going to teach my friends while I'm doing it, because you also probably got a lot of like, oh, okay, that word I used didn't land. Like nobody understood what I was saying, or, oh, this works better. Or, oh, this injury is coming up. This person can't do this. How do you get those ahas while you're still in your program, so that you can then take those questions to the teacher and be like, hey, so how come this happened? Yeah, that's amazing. I was lucky enough that I actually taught hair before I became a yoga teacher. So I was an educator before I took my teacher training. So I used to teach advanced hair color technique, both in like kind of workshop format and beginner as well. And then also on the road. So I was on stages and traveling a lot and hooked up to mics and like doing all this crazy art stuff on hair. And that gave me an advantage when I did my teacher training. And also as a child, I used to sing, and I sang in a few competitions where I was on stage with just me and the piano, and not me playing the piano, but the piano player myself, and then like an audience. And although I would never say I enjoyed that as an introvert, it did give me a little bit more comfort with being at the front of the room and knowing how to look at people and see if they were understanding my words or not, like if things were landing, how to project my voice. Like there was just a lot of little tools that I came in with that I could see when my other teacher friends would start doing their practice teaching, I could see them really scrambling with, like even just projecting your voice. Like so many were really soft, just like everyone was like, we can't hear you, you know, and they would try to speak louder, but they just didn't have the ability yet to draw that voice like from their diaphragm and kind of project it out. Um, they were so uncomfortable being at the front of the room that they couldn't kind of be present to what they were witnessing while they were there, and so they would miss kind of obvious cues that they could offer and things. And I remember just feeling at the time so much compassion for them and also so much relief that I had walked in with this tool set, because I just thought, oh my God, if I was standing at the front of the room, so in my head about the fact that I'm standing at the front of the room, because what do they say, that public speaking is like one of the biggest universal fears for people, you know? So if I had that going on and was trying to use my words and trying to see the room, and like it would have been a lot. So we did a lot of that while we were in training, thankfully. But I do feel like having that advantage is just such a gift, like being, and same with you as a performer, right, and a dancer. It's like you already knew how to kind of like arrive and bring your presence to the situation without feeling like, oh, all the things. And then it's just a matter of like, okay, now I have all this information, and how do I bring this information out to these people in a skillful way without all the other baggage attached. So definitely a blessing.
Definitely a
Yeah.
blessing. Yeah. And because yoga feels so, well, this is a statement, maybe a sweeping statement. I think because people fall in love with the feeling of practicing yoga, that there's this assumption that teaching yoga will have the same feeling. But when they stand up in front of a group, a totally different hat needs to be put on. And that can be so confronting just to be seen, even though when you're being seen as a teacher, and it's alarming, you will instantly forget that everybody that's practicing is in that I'm feeling good because I'm practicing my yoga. They're not actually,
Paying
they're
attention
not
to you.
judging
Yeah.
you. They're
Yeah.
not paying attention to you. They're there for themselves. But that's the gap right there. I think
Yeah.
that's the chasm, how to
Yeah.
get comfortable in that space.
Yeah. I remember a teacher, and I can't remember even now who it was, saying that one of the ways that they addressed that when they first started teaching is they got everyone in child's pose at the beginning of the class, and they taught from the back of the room and slowly walked to the front. And I remember thinking, oh, that's a hack, you know? I mean, I did that when I used to sing on stage. I always used to close my eyes because I found that if I was looking at the people, it pulled me out of my internal experience of my voice. Now, obviously, we can't do that when we're teaching yoga. We can just sit up there and close our eyes. But um, yeah, I just, yeah, there's so much opportunity there for, if anyone's listening to this who runs trainings, to kind of maybe consider rethinking your model to include mentorship, and maybe encouraging them, like you said, like partway through to start teaching their friends in their living room or things like that, so that while they're in the program, they're kind of getting their feet wet with all of this. Um, yeah. And for me, I think teaching hair color technique and theory allowed me to really hone the ability to, first of all, understand that there's different learning styles, and that I may have to phrase things in a different way or approach things in a different way for different people in the room uh, to have it land. Um, and I also got really good at watching people's eyes and their expression to see like that spark of like, aha, they got it. And when it's like you're throwing words at me and I'm glazed over, you know? Yeah, such a gift. And so after you took that training, where did you go from there as far as more trainings? And I know you said eventually you got yin training and then you started teaching there, but like where's the in between there?
Sure. Uh, Probably halfway through that year, I, like many people, realized I had a burning desire to go to India and
Mm.
go to the source. And I just started researching and planning where I would go and what I would do. And I ended up going to, almost straight after I finished, I went to India for 6 months. And because I'm the kind of person that I am, I planned a lot of things and I booked ahead into a lot of different courses. And a studio that I'd been practicing at in Melbourne gave me a hot scoop for like a beautiful place to go and learn. And then a good friend of mine said, oh, hey, my parents teach a 5-week yoga intensive at this place in India. Here's the link. And it was the same place. So that was quite a magical alignment moment. And so I ended up, I went to this beautiful ashram, very much off the grid in Gujarat, which is right at the widest, fattest part of India on that west coast, with a living guru who's there in this beautiful, old, ancient space where you're pretty much walking amongst old mango trees, and there's not many Westerners there. And it was a place where asana wasn't the primary way that we practice yoga. It was all bhakti, it was all chanting, and it was a school for Indian boys as well that were learning all the ancient Vedic skills of their lineage, but also getting an education so they could choose what they wanted to do. And it was sublime. If I haven't described it in a sublime enough language, it was sublime. And it was this lovely complement to a training that I had done over a year, which was quite modernized. The year-long training was very much about how do we offer yoga to the modern city-goer people that live in Melbourne, Australia. So lots of prenatal and lots of awareness of medical conditions and all of those things that are important. Whereas this was very much stripped back, traditional, starting in Shavasana on the floor, soaking in history. It was gorgeous. And what was really funny is when we did our anatomy module, in quite a Troy McClure way, the instructors, at the time I thought it was a bit lazy, but the instructors put on Paul Grilly's anatomy video DVD.
Oh, funny.
And I thought, you're just going to give us a video to watch? And as I reflect back, I think, oh, that was a genius move, because
that's what I do.
It's brilliant. And I wrote down such intense notes. And it's quite a nod to how you need repetition of things, because when I studied with Paul later, which I'll get to, I realized that I'd heard all of this before, but it really didn't sink in because it was so revolutionary. And after I finished the time that I spent there, I traveled down through India a little bit more. I did a workshop with Mati Ezrati, beautiful Mati, bless her, which was amazing. And I also did some time at an Ayurvedic college because I had fallen in love with Ayurveda when I did my year-long training. And that really lit the spark for Chinese medicine that came later, because there's so many parallels with those medicinal systems. And a little while after that, once I'd finished my travels, I came back to Australia and I got a job teaching at a studio straight away, which was a hot studio where I was teaching a Barkin method. So it was sort of Bikram, Barkin. It was like a template class where you teach the same class every time. And you can color it in a little differently. You can bring a different theme. And I actually thought that was brilliant, because it meant that all the skills of getting off your mat, walking around the room, feeling confident to start offering adjustments if that was appropriate, were there, because you weren't tied to your notes of this super intricate creative class you'd made every single class. And that is feedback that I give to new students. Sometimes I say, hey, and you probably do the same thing, create some templates of classes that you can know off the back of your hand, and then you get to be creative and colorful with how you present it, or the format, or the story that you want to wrap it up in. But you don't have to keep checking your notes. So
yeah. I do give that advice. And I also tell them, like, even if they're not teaching in a registered series, which I much prefer to drop in, but even if they aren't, to kind of build sequences that build on each other over the weeks, so that even if they do have a moment where they're like, oh, it's like, oh wait, last week we did this, okay, so now I'm going to add this little nugget to that pose, and it kind of becomes like this. I often say to my public in my public classes that I don't ever have a class plan. I used to have a very rigid plan with a theme, and it was all, this is long, for those of you listening, long before iPads and iPhones, so that's how long I've been doing this. So it was, like type it up on a computer, print it out, put it in one of those clear protective sleeves, toss it in my bag. So if I got tea on it, it didn't, and that was what I taught for that week. And, it had a theme and it had a matching meditation and all of that. And I was really, really attached to those. The style of yoga I was trained in also was a bit rigid. Initially, it was the Iyengar tradition. And so there's very, very much some structure there. And it wasn't until I actually forgot it at home one week and had to kind of wing it that I stopped doing that. But now what I say is that I have what I call like a recipe, because I have an idea always of what I want to do in a drop-in class. But I can add and subtract ingredients if it doesn't fit the needs of the group that day. So, and if you're a new teacher right now listening to this and this freaks you out because you want to have a plan, please know I did not do this for the first 3 years that I taught. I had a very specific plan that I stuck to, period, the end. It wasn't until I forgot the plan and had to ad lib that I was like, oh, there's this whole other part of me as a teacher that I hadn't tapped into because I was so stuck to my plan. And having that class be what I called a request class, because I forgot my thing. I didn't tell everybody, by the way, I forgot my lesson plan. I just was like, let's make it a request class. Let's go around and just popcorn, how are you doing today? What's sore, what's tight, etc. And then I just created the class on the fly based on what I heard from them. If you would have told me before that was possible for me to do that, I would not have believed you. I would not have thought. But because I had been writing out, typing out, practicing these sort of frameworks for years, it was easy for me to take that structure and then let's just add something in for their neck. And oh, so-and-so said something about their wrists, and let's just add a little bit in for that. And now I never have a plan. My recipes always include, like, I always joke and say, it's like you get your neck, shoulders, upper back, middle back, lower back, your hip, butt, IT band, and your hip flexors. Those are always included for the mission, but anything else can be added or subtracted based on what the group says at the beginning of class. But I would never have started that way. That would have been anxiety provoking to start that way, for sure.
I love that idea of a recipe. I call it a score in Yin Yoga. I say we've just got a score. Maybe that's because I've got that real abstract art it's
a dance background. Yeah.
Yeah. And what a moment of trust, starting out feeling my security blanket is my process of typing out my notes and having my plan and feeling really safe. And universe or spirit going, you know what, today I'm just going to remind you that you've got it all in you. You don't need this as a crutch anymore. Great foundations that you've laid, and now it's in you. And I feel like that's a nice nod to what we were saying before about the time spent learning and getting things into your body, out of your brain and into your body, means that you're a walking archive of little sequences and things that have worked well and things to try, and it can all just flow out of you rather than feeling that you don't trust yourself as a teacher, because that's a big part of it, right? Yes. People don't trust that they can do it, or feel like they're an imposter and look at all these other great teachers and think, oh my goodness, how could I teach? I'm not as good as that person. And very difficult to get their confidence to grow from there.
Yeah, when I mentor teachers, and they don't like it when I say this, but it is the truth to me. Part of the reason they struggle so much with that is because they're not practicing. When you give yourself time on your own mat to play, and without like super structure, without following a teacher, to just like, oh, right now I feel like doing this, and like, oh, now that just kind of lent into this really well, and oh, now I feel like I need this. You get these beautiful sequences that, as a dancer would be more intuitive for you, but for someone who's not, we can tend to be too structured, but things can just kind of flow into each other in a way that you wouldn't have thought of if you were just sitting there with your brain and a pen and paper trying to write it down. And universally after that class, almost everybody, I think, except for maybe 2 people, came up to me afterwards and their feedback was, that's the best class you've ever taught us. So then I was like, what the fuck am I doing sitting here for hours a week, writing this out, picking a theme, picking a meditation, typing it all out, print, like what am I doing? Like if I started teaching yoga, which I did, to be of service, to help people heal, to be a space holder for them to go on their own process and have some time for themselves so that they could go out then and spread that mojo, then why am I so attached to this sequence? Like if actually what they needed was just a longer shavasana, or they needed this breath because most of them were feeling anxious today and that wouldn't have been on my plan. So yeah, it really switched me from not only I would say moving from being an instructor to a teacher in that transition, but also brought me back to the point, which was to be of service. You know, when I was removing my plan, air quotes for those of you listening, and pushing that aside, I was able to be present to like what is in front of me and what do they need? And that's what we do. So yeah, and now that being said, if I'm teaching a specially themed workshop, I have a plan and I have a structure, and we don't do the check-in. Like if I'm doing a seasonal class for yin going into summer, that is got theory and more structure and things like that. But from week to week, it's like I do have this recipe, but things can always be added and subtracted and customized as needed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what a beautiful evolution, because those first steps were absolutely crucial. And it makes me think of things that I say in my yin teacher trainings, which is, you know, the more you, as a teacher, the more you can get out of the way, the more that you can get out of the way of your initial reactivity about what you think is going on for somebody, putting a story onto someone's experience when you're really just guessing, and interfering unnecessarily, saying a lot more than you need to unnecessarily. There's space for you to kind of come back to that service role rather than it's all about you as an instinctive response. And that does take time, because it's also a process of your own reflection and your own personal growth of realizing, actually, everyone's okay. What just came up for me? Wow, well, I'm going to watch that, and I'm not going to let that lead the next decision that I make as a teacher. I'm actually going to do the buzzword, which is hold space and give the room space, give people space.
Which of course is the gift of a yin practice, is that there is that ability to have time enough in the shapes to give space without having to say, okay, inhale, put your foot here, exhale, do this. You know, there is that spaciousness. Yeah. It definitely wouldn't have happened as a new teacher, because I was definitely, my heart intention was there that like, I want to teach because I love yoga and it helped me so immensely. And so I want to spread that. So that was there, but I was so up in my head about it. I remember even, it's interesting that you said that like the universe kind of gave me that little knock, knock. Actually, this is what we're going to try now. Because I had a couple knocks later in, as well. When, you know, teach the universe, I would get these little voices in my head that would say things like, you should share this story about the time that you blah, blah, blah. And I would think, what? Shh, back to hamstrings, you know? And then you should, especially as a former singer, you know, you should chant here to your students. And I'd be like, anyway, push that aside. That happened for years before finally, you know, you should share that story. And I was like, all right, fine, I'm going to share the damn story. And then people were like, that is exactly what I needed to hear today at the end of class. And I was like, oh, right. So me thinking, I don't want to share this story about a situation in my life because this isn't about me. It's about them. That's what I was thinking. You know, it was like, yeah, but this isn't about me. It's not about my story. It's about them. But what I misunderstood is that sometimes sharing your story is the way that you can relate as human to human with people, right? When you share kind of a story of your own journey in an area, or a struggle that you've had that like you've kind of moved through, or an aha moment that you've had based on your own life, people relate to that, so there was that. And then the chanting part, yeah, I think I just was like, why would I do that? But then I remembered that actually I had a teacher in my first teacher training, and she had a okay voice, but she, certainly wasn't in the choir or anything. But she used to, at the very end of Shavasana, sing just part of a little song to us. And I remember that every time she did it, it moved me to tears.
Mm.
And yet, here I am, a former singer, teaching, hearing this voice in my head saying, you should chant to your students when they're in Shavasana, and going, shh, So when I did, of course, again, same thing. Everyone was like, oh my God, that's so beautiful. Why haven't you been doing that? I'm like, because I'm all up in my head, just like the rest of you are, So yeah, it's really interesting when you feel like as a teacher, you can get out of the sort of the mental muck of like my sequence, then these other things start to come in where you're able to be like, oh, I'm getting an intuitive hit. Or like you said, oh, I'm noticing I'm having a reaction to this, or I'm having thoughts about this situation or this person. And now I can like step back from that and go, what's that about? Instead of making it like something you need to do in the class, Yeah.
Mm.
So you
And the
come
difference
back.
might be there. Oh, sorry. I
Oh,
was going
no,
to
go
say the
ahead, please.
difference with the chanting would possibly be that as that was coming through, it was a gift for the students. It wasn't a performative moment. And
100%.
that might be the thing that's different about that.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's exactly what it was, because I'm sure the first time I did it, it was probably a little bit hesitant in my voice, because of this, like, okay, I'm just gonna do it. Whereas, my former opera singer training, there wouldn't have been any hesitance. It would have been, just come out. And it does tend to now, for the most part. There's the odd time where sometimes they're in Shavasana and I'm just witnessing the absolute awe-inspiring beauty of that moment, to the point where I get a little bit moved to tears. And then if I chant, it will be a little wavery, but I think the emotion behind it comes out anyway, so it's fine. But there are plenty of times that I do look around the room when people are in their final stillness practice and just think, holy fuck, I get to do this for a job. Like, what? This is amazing, Yeah. Yeah.
That's so great.
So I would love to hear about your journey from, okay, you've come back and you witnessed Paul. It's so interesting that you said that about the DVD, because that's actually how I've done it in my trainings. And again, it wasn't laziness. It was because, for two reasons. One, because the odds that I'm going to get the gamut of human variation in a teacher training are very slim. Right? Anyone who's not seen the DVD, I'm going to use some names here. If you have not watched this, I keep saying DVD because that's what it was when I got it, but it is also available streaming for those of you who are not Gen X dinosaurs like myself. If you haven't watched it, again, I cannot recommend it enough. There's always a link in every episode notes to that DVD. So, for example, we had the Bob and the Ivy extremes, whereas Bob had really limited range of motion in his bone structure, and Ivy was like this strange magical unicorn of all ranges of motion and everything. And I just know that when I'm teaching the average group of yoga teachers, I might have an Ivy, or I might have a people that are kind of Ivy-esque or maybe in the middle, but the odds that I'm going to have a Bob and an Ivy in one group to really clearly demonstrate, like, this is how different we can all be from here to here. I just knew that I wasn't going to be able to replicate that in a way that was as much of an aha as that presentation does. So when I taught it live, we didn't watch the whole thing, but we'd watch about 90 minutes of it together. And then I would, of course, recommend that they buy the whole DVD. And then when I teach now in my program, because it's online, that's actually a prerequisite. They have to buy it and they have to watch it. And then their first homework assignment is reflection questions based on it. Because I just think there's the odds of me being able to, especially in Zoom, like to be able to do that, other than just showing them a bunch of pictures of bones, which doesn't land that well. So then you come back.
Yeah, you got to see it moving.
Yeah, you on real humans, and maybe, and if the space allows for and the people allow for, even like touching the bodies is helpful, but it's not always possible. So you that's so funny that you were like, really? You're just going to play us a DVD? So you take that, you come back, and then when did you decide, okay, now I want to study with Paul more, or dive into yin deeper, or like watch this presentation again, or?
Yeah. Well, the studio that I was teaching at, where I was teaching the class that you teach and you repeat it and you get to color it in, excuse me, was great. But I very quickly realized it wasn't lighting me up. It wasn't my path. And yin was just cracking into the culture in Melbourne at that time. This might have been about 2012, I think.
Okay.
A few people were teaching it, but it was still very new and it hadn't exploded the way that it has now. And I was given an opportunity to start teaching it at this studio. And I did a couple of weekend trainings with someone who had trained with Paul a lot, which was great. And I loved it, as a lot of people do. Excuse me. A lot of people do when they find yin. Where has this been? Oh my goodness. And I knew that I wanted to dive deep. And I'm the kind of person that will go overseas, find the good training, find the good teacher, make a big investment, invest in myself. That's just how I roll. And I was given, at this time, I was lecturing at the academy, at the Australian Yoga Academy. And they had somebody who was teaching the yin component, or they were teaching a 50-hour yin teacher training. And because I was already teaching the skeletal variation notions from the Paul Grilly DVD, and I'd done a lot of that research on my own, this person decided to leave the academy and they said, hey, Karina, would you step up and teach the yin? I said, of course, but I've got to go and do some more training first. So the first training that I did, and I think this was 2017, so a few years later, was with Bernie. I came to Canada and I did Bernie's 50-hour, which was brilliant. And I had things kind of were already overlapping because I'd gone back to university when I came home from India, and I knew I wanted to do something more health-based and scientific. And I tried to get into physiotherapy, but I didn't have the grades from high school to get in. They still based it on your grades from high school, which were just like a smidge off.
Ditto. I actually really would have, I would have been a physiotherapist too if I had the muster. Yeah.
I'm so grateful that didn't happen. It was not my destiny. And I did a couple of years of podiatry, which was also not a good fit, but the anatomy was great. The wet lab was awesome. You were doing all of these studies of cadavers, and that's a rare thing to have access to. So I was really grateful for that. And then my acupuncturist, who's incredibly psychic, was feeling my pulses, and she said, have you transferred into Chinese medicine yet? And I said, no. Do you know something that I don't know yet? And she backtracked because she realized that was a spoiler alert and said, you might end up doing that. And then within a year, I had transferred from podiatry to Chinese medicine. So when I went to Canada with Bernie, I was already in the very beginning of my TCM degree, maybe first year, or it was second year, I think, where we were learning all the points and we were learning all the primary channels. And so Bernie was the first person that talked about things that I'd never heard of before. Bernie was the first person that I'd heard talk about piezoelectricity, different theories of what chi might be, the theories of water molecules coming together to one GAG, and perhaps that the channels are pathways of fluid that are conducting a current of electricity. And I was like, I'm at acupuncture school and no one's talking about any of these theories. And the way that Bernie gives you this lovely quantifiable information for things that are very esoteric was appealing to me. And that's his strength. He's amazing at that.
I believe he got that information though from Dr. Motoyama, if I'm not.
Okay.
I could be wrong. Apology to Bernie if I am wrong, but I think that going into those, some of the, or at least that was probably the beginning of the rabbit hole. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It was awesome. And it really just got my brain ticking on different ways to consider energy in the body. And when I came back to Australia, I started creating my first 50-hour teacher training. And at the time, my whole apartment was just full of lists and notes and books and things that I wanted to include as I created, at the beginning, what was quite a monster of a training, because I put everything I'd learned into it. And as we'll discuss as the conversation unfolds, I'm now at a place where I want to simplify that and weed a lot of that out, because like you with your intense notes, it doesn't need to be that heavy anymore. It doesn't need to be that structured anymore for me, because it's evolving.
Before we get to that, I want to backpedal and ask you a question. So you were saying that it was like 2012-ish that kind of yin started picking up in Australia? Okay.
I think so.
I think y'all might be a little bit behind Canada and the US as far as like when the trends hit in yoga, because I had the DVD of Paul's in maybe 05, 06. I finished my first teacher training in 2004 and just kind of taught what I was taught, and then stumbled across his presentation and then started changing the way I taught certain things based on like these aha moments. And then it was 2007 that I just happened to be walking by a yoga studio that I never go into because it was an Ashtanga studio and that's not my jam. But I was looking for a gift for a friend who was a yogi. I wanted to buy her a bolster. And I thought, oh, maybe they have them in there. I mean, unlikely it's Ashtanga, but who knows, right? So I walked in, and before I even got upstairs, there was a cork board with like upcoming posters. And there was a picture of Paul Grilly there. And it said a yin yoga workshop, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'd never heard of yin ever, but I knew that face. And I was like, that's the guy from the DVD that like changed everything. And so I didn't know what yin was, didn't even look at like, I knew. And I also, ironically, Kismet had that weekend off, whereas normally I taught Saturdays, but because it was summertime, I wasn't. And so I didn't have to get, and there was no way for me to get subs because they were registered series. So it was actually like, I'm free. And I just like looked at the dates and was like, oh my God. And I just walked upstairs and was like, sign me up. Like no idea what yin was. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And that was 2007. So I feel like in the US, it had actually been around for many years before that, even before Paul sort of took his show on the road up to the Great White North here. So yeah, it's just interesting to hear the timeline of like when things kind of like tick off in different parts of the world.
Yeah, and people were quite dubious of it at first. And it did
Same
take a
thing.
while before people got it. And now they get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the beginning, it was like constant, like you said, dubious questions and just like skepticism. Now, of course, anyone who's listening to this now and has been a more recently trained teacher or yin teacher, it's like, I will bet you there are teachers out there right now that have never taught at a time when yin wasn't being offered, you know? Yeah. Yeah.
And as it was beginning to become more known, the trend in Melbourne was hot yoga. Not necessarily Bikram, but practices done in a hot room where you sweat. Yeah. So the pendulum was swinging.
Yes.
and
as it does.
It has swung all the way back this way now, which I love. And so the next year I started running my first 50-hour teacher trainings in yin yoga. And that was amazing. And it wasn't until the next year that I was able to go and do level 1 with Paul in California. I'd been on the waiting list for ages and ages.
Yeah.
And that just helped to cement so much, and more things clicked into place, which was fabulous. And I was signed up to do level 2 the following year, but that's when the great unpleasantness descended upon the world. And that ended that idea.
I absolutely love that description. One of my students is always like, in the before times. Yes.
In the before times. Well, that's a quote of my friend. My friend Dominique says that, the great unpleasantness. And I just think it's nicer.
It is. It is. Yeah. Other than what else, all the other things we could call it. I was very lucky that I managed to get like 500 hours in before the great unpleasantness. I think maybe my last one might have been 20, I don't know, time, it's nebulous. It might have been like 2018, 2017, in that range, I think, was the last time. No, I wasn't planning on that being the last one, obviously. I was just going to keep going, even though I had 500. It was like, as soon as I have the funds, I'm, I'll be there. If I could have, I'd be every year. Like that time, was it at Land of the Medicine Buddha that you did your first one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That time in that place was, I can't even put it into words. Like when people say to me, go to your happy place, that's where my mind goes. Land of the Medicine Buddha, studying with Paul and Susie. And so, I plan to just keep going. But then as you said, the great unpleasantness happened and now everything has changed. And so I do, of course, want to go study with Paul again. And they've also changed that last year that I was with them. They started shifting the way that they were doing it. They left Yoga Alliance and they were starting to offer more shorter trainings that were more philosophy based and not really trainings in yin per se. And when I asked Paul about that, he said the reason being is that he had trained so many of us that were now out training yin teachers. He kind of felt like it's better for me to now support you all with extra trainings than to be doing these basic yin trainings when you all can just do them, So yeah, so interesting. Yeah, that was such a beautiful, magical place. For sure.
And when you go to your happy place, do you go to the forest out the back?
It's actually interesting. Yes, every day I was in the forest, but there's a lot of good forests where I live. So partially, yes, but actually there's this one snapshot I have of leaving that comes back all the time, of leaving my room in the morning and going down the little path, because I was in the far room, Tara House, I think it was, by the school and stuff there. So like the furthest room kind of away, and going on that little path, walking with my, my sweater, because it's Northern California, first thing in the morning. So it's chilly, it's cool. And just seeing the fog and the mist over all of the trees and the big prayer wheel and the prayer flags and just that feeling, it just like, that's the spot, So yeah, when I go to my happy place, which is so funny because it took me years and people would be like, go to your happy place. I'm like, happiness isn't a place. What do you mean? But that memory, but then I heard somebody describe it as use a really happy memory. And that's when I finally understood. Well, that's what people mean when they say go to your happy place. They mean a memory, not like a location kind of thing. So yeah, it's that snapshot of like, the fog and the trees and the prayer wheels and all of the love and the excitement of like what's about to happen that day. And yeah, pretty magical. Very grateful that,
so
I mean, I
magical.
think any of us that have been there and studied with him, the gratitude for having been able to do that even is huge,
So grateful. I was so grateful to be able to do that, because as we've now witnessed, in lots of ways that are pros and lots of ways that are cons, the digitalization of trainings now has changed a lot. And I was going to say before, for the students that are doing a 200-hour training that's purely on Zoom, that creates even more challenges. I mean, we could do a whole episode on learning digitally without physically touching anybody, but we could say heaps about that. Yeah, and also super grateful for the access to different things that I've had now, because even this last year I spent 6 months studying with a world-class, phenomenal acupuncturist purely on Zoom with a global community, and that would not have been possible pre-unpleasant times.
Yeah. I think to me, it's like, I'm always, and maybe it's because the yin in me, but I'm always like, when people are like online or in person, I'm like, well, it depends. Or yes, and because I think that both have advantages. I do really feel an immense amount of sadness and compassion for teachers that have taken their whole first training online, because it really is a case of like, you don't know what you're missing, Yeah. And whether or not that can accurately prepare people for now going out in person and dealing with bodies, I don't know. That's like you said, that would be a discussion for another time. But I do feel like there's just this sense of like the energy of the room and being in the space with your teachers and with your colleagues, and like kind of intuitiveness that those trainings can have that just is really hard to translate onto Zoom. And I offer a fully online training, and at the time of this recording, it's like a 60+ hour. I'm sure eventually it's going to be longer because that's just how I roll. And I'm happy to do it online. And I'm just in the last few months have thought, would I be also open to like doing that, away somewhere, like going to Mexico and having it be a 2-week thing as opposed to, and I'm definitely open to it. I don't know if like how hard I'm going to work towards that at this point, but I do feel like, there is a group of people that just know they learn better that way, and the experience of it. And I think if you're going to do an immersion like that in a shorter period of time, when you do it and you can leave your life is the only way that that's possible. Because the reason that I could do 100 hours in, I don't even remember what they were. They weren't even quite 2 weeks, I don't think, with Paul, was because once I arrive at Land of the Medicine Buddha, I'm off the hook. I don't have to buy groceries. I don't have to cook. I don't have to clean my room. I don't have to do my laundry even. I'm just able, in the first 2 trainings, I just put an auto responder on my email. I didn't even bring a computer. I was just like, nope, I'm unplugged. And so it's much easier to deal with that kind of an immersive training where you're getting a lot when that's all you have to do and all you have to be responsible for. But trying to do that and then like deal with your house and the kids and the this and that, like, yeah, too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it feels like a good time in the conversation to share what my process was of creating that first yin teacher training.
I have one question that leads into that.
Okay.
Okay. So you mentioned that you were doing, you'd kind of, they had poked you and said, hey, do you want to do this training for us? And you said, yes. However, first I must go study. The question I have is, was the first one that you created with them, or were you doing it solo?
I decided that I would keep the IP and that I would do it. They wouldn't pay me to create it. They wouldn't pay me for my time to create it. And that gave me the freedom to do independent trainings, and that they didn't own it.
Yes,
and they were lovely. They gave me that option.
Yeah. Yeah.
We kept the copyright.
Yeah.
Which was a beautiful conversation that we had. And they were really upfront. They said we could do it 2 ways. We could pay you to write it and create it, but that means if you leave the company, then we own the material and anyone else can pick up your work and teach it. And I was like,
I had exactly the same thing with the yoga therapy college that I taught at. And I was the one who said, actually, I want plan B option, as in I own this material. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Which was a good move. And
absolutely.
So that also meant that if I wanted to run my training independent of them through the year, there was no animosity or weirdness because we'd been really upfront, which was great. Yeah.
And then you could go wherever you wanted to teach it.
Yeah. So I set about putting everything that I'd learned into it that I thought was relevant and useful. And the first installation of this training was massive. I did it over 6 weeks. So I did one day a week.
Nice.
A weekend day. But they were 8 a.m. till 5 p.m.
Ooh.
Of these really big sections where I was literally standing and delivering content. And it cooked me. And I could see that it cooked the group. They were there going, wow, this is amazing. This is fascinating. But my brain sponge is dripping wet. I cannot.
The eyes have glazed over and they're like, yeah.
Yeah. Fully. And it became really apparent that after doing that sort of 2 or 3 times, actually, it was the great unpleasantness that gave me the opportunity to like reroute how I was doing it, because couldn't do it in person. And my brother, who's a whiz at videography and marketing, said, hey, why don't we film your entire course and you just speak to camera and we'll do the animations and we'll put all of the notes in and we'll do graphics. And then what you can do is create an on-demand version of it if people want to do training with you without you having to be there. And then as I moved forward, my up until this year where things are changing, I was then shifting the format where the big chunky theory modules, instead of me standing and talking it out, I would give it to my students and they would watch that through the week whenever it suited them. And they were in little bite-sized 10-minute videos on a platform that was kind of easy to tick off as you watch it when they've got time. And then when we would come together on the practical day as a group in person, it would be more do a practice with me, practice teaching each other at the end of the day. And in between all those sections that you've watched, let's just talk about it.
Q&A. Yeah.
What came up? Q&A. Let's look at something that came up. Who feels like they've got a hyperextended elbow? Great. Come up. Do you mind coming up and we'll take a look at that? So it was more conversational, less didactic, and that worked really well. But now what I'm finding is that, and this is where I'm at the moment, and what I feel is a good, important conversation for the yin yoga community, is that because I was so excited about learning meridians and primary channels, I put all the information in there about every primary channel, where the points are, not what the points do, but the emotions.
Point by point location. Yeah.
Almost point by point. We kind of walk through the channel, and then if you want to create a sequence that's around any of these themes, here are some postures that cover those regions of the body. So it's comprehensive. But I remember the first couple of years of doing that, people were very engaged because they were learning about themselves and going, oh, wow, that large intestine emotion of holding things and not letting things go, that's really relevant for me. But in the last couple of years, when everyone's totally Zoom fatigued, when I open up that discussion on that day and say, hey, how did you go with the content this week? Everyone drops their eyes, they pull out their book, and I know they either haven't watched it or it was just too much. And I keep thinking to myself, I'm cooking these guys. I got to change this. This is, and why am I teaching this to them? Why? Was it egoic? Was it, hey, I learned heaps of stuff, I want you to know that I know things? That was part of it. The other part was, wow, I'm in a privileged position where I've been able to learn this, and you might not ever go to uni. Also, I'm in a privileged position to have learned from Paul Grilly, who's phenomenal, and perhaps you will never go and learn from him. So it feels like a sense of duty to share, like you said before, share the information, don't be miserly with it. Let's all grow and learn. You know, there are things from Paul that I teach the TDQ, and I also say to the student that myofascial group, I also say to the students, I never, ever, ever mention this in yin classes. You might not ever mention it either, but because I learned this from Paul, I want you to have the information and you do with it what you want.
Exactly. It's really interesting that you said, and I also think though, you know, you said the ego part, but like also, don't you feel like there's just like this part of you that's the inner nerd that's so excited by this stuff that you just want to share it all. You want to tell them all the things, you know, because you are so into it and so passionate about it that it's like, how could I not share this? And then, yes, I know what you mean. There's a point where you're like, okay, but are they using any of this? Are they understanding any of it? Or are they using these things in a way that maybe actually aren't accurate because they have a snapshot of this as opposed to because when I don't know what it's like studying TCM where you are, but here in this, and it's province by province here, so it's slightly different in Alberta than BC, etc. But here in BC, they have kind of 3 levels. There's registered acupuncturist, there's Chinese medicine herbalist, and then there's and then you can combine those, and then there's the full doctorate where it's like all the things. And it's incredibly intense study and many, 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 many hours of clinic and really intense board exams. You know, like it's a lot. So here anyway, I'm assuming it's the same where you are. If you want to get through, like you got to really love what you're doing, because like the amount of times that I was crying into textbooks, let me tell you, you know, that I was just like, why isn't this sticking in my head? Or like, wait, what does this point do again? Or like, it's so much information. And then of course there's your practicum, which is like a whole other level. And then if you add herbs to that, that's like, it's incredibly, it's a big amount of information. And I know what you mean about like, how do we, like, now how do I sit with all this information and decide like, what do I leave out and what do I leave in when I love it all? It's like, it's really hard to be like, okay, but what do they need and what will serve them and what's just kind of extraneous, awesome coolness
Yes.
that they won't ever actually use in their classes. I was lucky
Right.
that my first training that I did for someone else, I only had 20 hours. So I had to like, so like no TCM, none of that. It was just like, this is what fascia is. Here's skeletal variation. Here's some poses. How do we make these accessible? Bing, bang, done. And even then, I felt like which is why I no longer teach that module anymore. I just felt like even then, like this should be called Intro to Yin Yoga because it was in a yoga therapy college and they took a module every weekend. And this yoga therapy program, and I think most of them are set up to give you a wide range of topics so that when you really feel piqued by something, once you finish your yoga therapy training, you can dive deeper into that specialty, whether it be back hair or cancer or whatever the thing is. And so, but I feel like sometimes the teachers in the program would do this small, in one weekend, 20-hour yin module and think certified to teach yin. And I was always just like, more like I dipped my toe in some yin. It's really not, it's not quite there. So I can totally understand that feeling of like wanting to give them all the goodness. What parts did you find where you're like now thinking, does that need to be there?
Yeah. Well, a preliminary thought to that is when I first started teaching yin, I got all this kind of feedback from other people that sort of told me that yin and meridians are like a joined system, that they go hand in hand. And I don't know exactly where I got that from, but it was sort of this assumed thing. And people would say to me, oh my goodness, you're a yin teacher and you're a Chinese medicine practitioner. How amazing, because they just go hand in hand. And now that I've had a few years under my belt and I've taught a lot of trainings and I'm in clinic and I'm diagnosing people, I'm starting to wonder, well, and you and I have had conversations off air about this, where did that come from? Who said that they would join? So I'll just put a little pin in that one. And then my real inquiry now is, if you're not a clinician, if you're not diagnosing people, if you're not giving a medical or a health intervention, a lot of this information is just going to muddy the class. Yes. And why are we teaching people how to do gua sha? Why are we teaching people about acupressure? Like, why are we doing that? Because, and you'll say this really eloquently because I know this is a thought on your mind a lot too. One thing doesn't fix another thing. And we can't just reduce a liver sequence to someone who's been diagnosed with cirrhosis or hepatitis, or, I mean, you and I have said, we see that a lot in forums. People like, hey, I've just been diagnosed with fibromyalgia. Which yin posture should I do? Or which meridian do I need to work on? And I feel a little bit, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be great if it worked that way? Like, oh, yeah, you just need to do dragon every day. It's going to fix that problem.
Yeah.
But that's what happens when people learn a tiny bit of a massive system and they cling to it and they frame it in a way that they've been taught medicine works, which is, take vitamin C if you've got
equals B.
X.
Yeah.
A equals B. And I feel a little bit responsible for that because I'm like, well, I was feeding that machine. And I've written a few blogs about this. And my best example is when you don't know the full system, and I don't even know the full system, I'm just dipping my toe in, and I've been studying and practicing now for, I don't know, 8 going on 10 years. When you teach this and then teachers are teaching this in their classes and they're excited. It's like when people go to a workshop and they learn something new and they put it in their class the next day.
Yeah.
if you've just learnt about the kidney meridian and you've learnt about the lower back and you've done all this stuff and you teach a class with enthusiasm and people do a couple of forward folds and they don't really understand the nature of thoracolumbar fascia, which is thick and dense, and when it yields and moves back, it can feel really, really achy and it can be alarming. What will often happen is people will go home and go, gee, the teacher was talking a lot about kidneys. My lower back hurts. I think there might be something wrong with my kidney organs. That's not a great outcome. We don't want people worrying about their health.
That is not skillful.
It's not skillful, but it's so innocent.
Yes.
And that's where I'm at now. I'm like, what information is actually useful for a yin practice? What is the yin practice for the student? It's not to be there and receive a seminar about Chinese medicine meridians, because they're not going to drop in. They're going to be in their head thinking about it and worrying about their body and worrying about their health. I want to step way back and go, simplify.
Yeah.
Drip feed. And I love your idea, which is what's relevant for how we relate to the world seasonally.
Yeah.
Perhaps emotional things that come up. What's useful for my inquiry about myself, not part practice, part pseudo Chinese medicine lecture. If that makes sense.
I want to touch on a few things. The whole part that you brought up about like, wait, where did we get this idea that yin and I'm just going to clarify yin as taught by Paul Grilly, because I realize there's other teachers out there. But yin is taught by Paul Grilly and Chinese medicine are like same. Paul does briefly talk about meridians in one of his levels, or used to, but it's not an in-depth deep dive into it. And Paul still has a huge amount of the Indian tradition and perspective, more so, I would say, actually, in his teachings. So I wonder if some of this came about when some of Paul's teachers then decided to run with this whole TCM thing. I know for myself, for the first many years that I ever taught yin, I never once mentioned a meridian because I hadn't studied TCM yet. And so I'm not going to speak to something that I haven't studied. And so my classes were very much about, here's the intended area, here's how we can work with our mind, here's some sensations you might notice, here's different versions of this you could take, or this pose instead. Like that was what I was teaching. Both my teachers that I was doing one-on-one apprenticeship with before I studied TCM, that was my model. It was like, oh, you want to learn yin? Okay, let's apprentice, which I love that model, but most teachers don't have the patience or time. They don't value the depth of knowledge and associate that with the time that it takes in order to do that. You know, that we're such a rush, you know, get it all in, get an intensive culture that like a lot of teachers unfortunately don't value the fact that like actually learning this information slowly in a dripped out way with a one-on-one mentor or in a small group is far better. So I don't know when that enmeshing started to happen. I'll speak to the way it enmeshed for me is that, so I studied with Paul Grilly. I'm coming back, I'm teaching yin. I was dealing with some serious health issues, serious enough that it was drastically affecting my life and my work. And I would go to my doctor and they would run the gamut of tests and they would say everything was in the air quotes range of normal. And I would go, but I'm not feeling normal. Like this is not me. I am usually the Energizer bunny. I'm like, go, go, go. And I barely can get out of bed. And like something is wrong, but getting no answers. Meanwhile, my chiropractor had recommended acupuncture because I have a chronic spot in my right trapezius from my previous life as a hairstylist that acts up sometimes. And what was happening is this fascia and muscle was so tight that even though he was adjusting me, it was like pulling me back out. And so he said, why don't you go try some acupuncture? And it was always on my list of like cool self-care things that I wanted to try. And so I was like, yeah, all right. And I went in and had my first consultation with her, and she listened to all my symptoms. And I said, I just can't get any answers from doctors. Oh, but by the way, I'm really here for this. But since you're asking all these wonderful in-depth questions, I'm just going to point out here, dear yoga teacher listening, an intake with a lot of in-depth questions and the education and skill to make a diagnosis. This is what needs to happen. And then when she, told me, she's like, oh, well, according to Chinese medicine, that's all the same thing. It's all connected. And I was like, say what? Say what now? And so, she treated me. I left that acupuncture session feeling like, again, like the same high that I had when I did my first yoga class times 5. I felt like I walked out into this noisy world with this beautiful energetic bubble around me. And I was just like floaty and like 100% aware of everything going around on me without it affecting me. And I was just like, I don't know what this is, but I'm going to get me some more. Like, I was like, whatever drug this is, hook me up again. And so studying with her, and then eventually seeing like a Chinese herbalist as well, and doing some supplementation, but also a bunch of Chinese theoried healing practices is what helped me. And so then I had this yin yoga, the word yin, and description of yin and yang, which is a Taoist concept, a Chinese concept. And I had all of this healing that I had gotten from seeing these two incredibly talented women, the acupuncturist and the TCM doctor, and going, something's peaked here. And so I started looking into studying Chinese medicine when I was still in Alberta, but I had a full roster of classes. Like I was in the Cadillac position as a yoga teacher of 10 classes a week, all self-run, making really good money, classes always full with a wait list. So to give that up to study TCM when it was like something I was interested in, but I didn't know that I wanted to do that. And the colleges there only offered it full-time, 8:30 to 4:30, Monday to Friday. So I would have had to remove some classes in order to even attend, and then more classes to be able to study and keep up with that course load. And so I just thought, I think that's too much of a risk for me. Fast forward to when I decided to move to the magical island here and realized that I would be starting with nothing. So some people in their midlife crisis buy a sports car, and I move to an island and go back to school. That's how I roll. And so I realized I would be here with no income, no clients, no commitments. And that if there was ever a time to go back to school, now was it. And so I originally was looking at yoga therapy because that was the other thing that I really wanted to study in Calgary, but just didn't have great options for. And that led me to the acupuncture college when I was doing my Googling. And I was like, oh, okay, well, now I can commit to being a full-time student and studying and all of this. I did also study Ayurveda in all of my teacher trainings. And for me, it felt like good, wise information, but it didn't resonate in my body the way that once I started studying TCM, where I was like, oh yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense. Everyone else in our foundations class was like, what are you talking about? So confused by this. And I was like, well, of course, like yin and yang, it just, to me, it was like, yes, all of this is brilliant. And so, I started studying. I realized early on when we started needling that was where, I realized it in my heart. My head took some time to convince that part wasn't what I was looking for. That although I love the medicine and I love the theory, that when I put needles in people, I felt kind of meh, like not gross, weird, not excited, happy, just meh, flat. And yet when I touch people's bodies, it's a whole other story. So somehow for me, having the needle between me and it wasn't for me. I love getting acupuncture. I'd get it every day if I could. But I wanted to like hand there or thumb there or like, and I had done other body modalities before this. So anybody who's thinking, I've already had done Thai yoga massage. We did some stuff with Paul. I had, and at Pacific Rim College, you learn a whole bunch of stuff with integrated physical exam and, surface anatomy and all, so I'd already done all that before I started actually touching bodies with this knowledge now. And that led me to go, I think I'm done with Chinese medicine here, because anything that I would do after that would be based on needling and like formulas and, you know, and so it's like, well, there's no further I can go here. You know, in the before times, the plan was to then take all of this and now go study medical Qigong, because that is very much, you know, body-based practices, but also hands-on. And so I was like, that's where I need to take this. And then of course, well, we all know what happened over the last few years. So that is still in the plan, but it's been kind of like tucked over here and this to the side for now. But one of the things that I really liked about what you just said was, and dear teacher, please, or person listening to this, please, before you react to this word, because apparently no one knows what it means anymore, I'm going to define it. The word ignorance does not mean stupid or dumb, like people think it does. It actually means you don't have the information. You don't have the knowledge, the information, or the skill. That's all it means. It's not a moral statement. It's not a judgment statement. It's not an insult. It's just like, I can't build a house. I'm very ignorant on how the hell I would build a house because I've never done it. I have no training in it. I have no experience in it. Right. So I would be ignorant in that regard. And I feel like sometimes that's what happens in yoga trainings, is that the students are so well intentioned and so enthusiastic that they, like you said, they want to take this information they just learned and now immediately put it into their class, but they're ignorant as to, they don't know how much they don't know, and to how nuanced this information is, and how individualized this information is, and how even though your intentions can be 100% good, it can be so irresponsible to be sharing this information without a depth of understanding. So you use the example of kidneys and back pain. And one of the ones that I've noticed come up all the time is, you know, they'll learn about the lung meridian and the grief. And so then they're working privately with someone who's grieving and they just want to do a bunch of poses that blast open the lung meridian. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, grief is heavy. Grief is individualized. Grief takes time. Maybe they need the opposite right now. Maybe they need to hug in, not like do heart openers so that they're like opening up the sinew channel of their lung meridian to process this grief. It's like, no, no, no. Grief has its own trajectory. And if you were going to a Chinese medicine practitioner or an acupuncturist saying you're grieving, they're not just going to needle your lung. This is the other thing that people don't realize, is that these channels all work together in this beautiful orchestra. So when I go see you for something, you may be needling some channel that I don't even think is connected, and maybe totally distally away from like where I'm actually feeling the sensation or the pain or the issue. And that's because you have studied in depth how these things are interconnected and interwoven, and how each point has an intention. And then when you combine it with this, how it makes its own magic. But if you combine it with this, it makes this other magic. And I just feel like good intentioned, but ignorant to the lack of the information that they have is what I see a lot. And then also just in the whole yogaverse, scope of practice is something that we need to talk about. Like, as a yoga professional, you are not qualified to be diagnosing and treating people. Period, the end, full stop. Now, if you have other certifications, qualifications, that's a different story. But if you are a yoga teacher, you should not be telling your student why they're experiencing back pain. That is beyond your scope of practice. You should be directing them to somebody like a physiotherapist or a doctor or a chiropractor. And then maybe if you have the skill and the knowledge and the training, when they come back with an understanding of what's going on, you can help them. Maybe. The average 200-hour teacher, probably not. So I feel like, I know you said that you felt like you were inundating them with all this information, that like, what are they actually going to use? And I pared it down quite a bit from what you taught, and still noticed this tendency to like, oh, well, my client was really angry today, so liver channel. It's like, they were angry today. Maybe they had a shitty day. Like, it's not a deep-seated anger pattern, you know? So I do just from the element perspective and mostly the seasonal perspective and element perspective, because I feel like that is something that teachers can work with, right? We all know, okay, we're in wintertime. Well, according to TCM, what are some of the qualities of winter? How could I bring some of those qualities of that season into my classes? And would that maybe help me decide what poses I choose based on the, and I don't even like to say the meridians because that could be a whole other rant for another time. But I think that yoga teachers focusing on the meridians is a mistake as well, because really in yin, we're addressing the sinew channels more so than like specific meridian points, because we're not doing acupuncture. So I always try to coach my students to, like, yes, I show them the meridian. Here's where it is. Now let's just slide that aside as, ooh, fun to know. And let's look at the sinew channel, because this is what you're going to be dealing with when you're teaching your students poses, is the fascia of their body. And so I keep it to, we do go over some of the, the role of the lung is this, but it's very like philosophical and not
Personal.
nothing that, yes, and nothing that they can take out and now start diagnosing people and things like that. And so I do keep it very like, if you wanted to teach a seasonal workshop for yin for the summer, what would we want to know about summer? Well, fire and, heat and these other things. And then, okay, so what would we want to do to harmonize that? And then if we look at the sinew channels of the body, like where are those sinew channels that are connected to the element of fire? So I kind of approach it from that way, because I do feel like, and even with yoga therapy students who get a whole other level of training, they still tend to get so excited with a small amount of information and just run with it too quickly without a deeper study. And I just think it's, like you said, when we are witnessing Facebook groups where we're just like, people are dropping questions in like, my student has back pain. What yin poses do you recommend for that? I recommend that they don't see you for their back pain. I recommend that you are part of a healthcare team, and that their physiotherapist is telling them what to do with their back pain. And I also recommend that you don't try to get this information from strangers on the internet in a Facebook group who are also wholly unqualified to answer this question for a student of yours that they've never even met. Like, how can we give good advice on something like that when we've never met the person, the teacher, let alone the student? We have no idea what's going on with their back. It's an impossible thing. And yet you'll see the comment thread fill up with well-meaning, but again, in the truest definition of the word, ignorance is bliss. Well-meaning, but ignorance as to what you know and what you don't know, trying to be helpful, but not realizing how that trying to be helpful can actually be exactly the opposite if we're not skillful. So that's my rant about that. But yes, so I can totally see, because I resist it every time. I can see where you felt like, all the things I want to give them, especially because you have such a wealth of knowledge. And I feel the urge every time I teach a teacher training to do that as well. Like I'll witness it in myself where I'm like, oh, and another thing. Oh, and did you know? And oh, and but I'll look at their eyes and see that they're already like, the overwhelmed mind says no, and it's like, okay, backpedal that, Yeah.
And that backpedal is a beautiful moment that I'm also having, where I'm realizing, how do I make the training more about the people doing the training and less about the things that I've got? Because just as what happens when you're a yin teacher, and over time you realize how much of you has been at the front of the space, it's kind of like, because I have a therapeutic job as well, I'm used to sitting with people and not getting involved when they are sharing and just letting them share. The same thing is happening with me as a teacher, where I am going, oh, I got to step back. I got to step back. I got to pull this back and let the people in my training take up more of the room that's in here, and for me to not oversaturate. And I love that you are aware that the sinew channels are a lot more relevant. And you've said that to me before, because in actual fact, as interesting and fascinating as all the knowledge is about the primary channels, they connect to the sinew channels, but their main role is at the organ level, making sure that 24 hours a day, the organs are safe. Most of the channels in the body are about protecting the organs, because once disease gets to the organs, life is threatened. So when we're applying stress to the body, the sinew, tiny little drop of something, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the sinew channels definitely relate to the musculoskeletal body because they're at that surface level, but they're so much more than that. They are also, they govern the way you relate to the world. So somebody might be coming to practice and they've got a chronically stiff back line, but it's not because they need to stretch more. It's because they've been defended their whole life because perhaps something happened and they brace. They're not sure if they're safe, and they've always kind of got to look over their shoulder.
Yeah.
Hey, Nick, can I just pause for a second? I've just got to plug in my laptop. Can we just make a note here of an edit? So sorry, hon, I'll be right back.
Okay, so you were talking about the sinew channels, and I want you to keep going on that because now I'm nerding out.
Yeah. And these are things that I've only been learning in the last 12 months because I've been studying with somebody whose teacher is the oral lineage holder of acupuncture from the Han Dynasty. So
wow.
This is like ancient acupuncture that's been diluted, and as does, things have been eradicated through history. And when you study TCM at TCM school, you pretty much just get taught the primary channels. But there's so many other channel systems that are doing all sorts of different things at any given time. And the sinew channels are the first things that we are affected by when we are meeting up with the world, whether it's checking the road to see if there's a car coming, whether it's, it's the sinew channels that pull your hand off a hot plate. You, in another system, you might think of that as a nervous system, but so the sinew channels also, they are holding that which we haven't received, or that which we have resisted. So that's why
we
when
haven't
Chinese medicine
to process or to move through, or right.
Exactly, which happens a million times a day. We get affronted by something, a thought, a person, a cold breeze,
an emotion,
an emotion. Yeah. So the sinew channels, whilst they are definitely something to be found in our matter, in our meat, there's so much more than that. And a practice where we are, and of course, so many other things happen in the psyche when we're in a yin practice, but a practice that primarily has its intervention as physical stress applied upon tissue is limited to what the rest of Chinese medicine can offer as an intervention for healing. And I think that's where I'm trying to get to is, and my catchphrase is TCM is not yin yoga, or yin yoga is not TCM, is not Chinese medicine. And not to rubbish anybody that's doing this in their classes, but we just want to be really clear about what is it that we're talking about, and to not give people the wrong idea of how they could heal their ail or what yin yoga is doing. This idea that yin yoga is the same as acupuncture. They're related. They're doing similar things.
I don't know who put that word out there, that phrase out there. And sometimes I wonder if these things are a matter of the telephone game. I don't know if you ever played that as a kid, where you all sit in a circle, somebody tells you something, you whisper it in someone's ear, they whisper. By the time you get back to you, you're like, that's not what I said at all. So I wonder sometimes if the statement doing yin yoga is like getting an acupuncture treatment, or yin yoga is like acupuncture, is being taken out of context to mean same, but maybe whoever actually said it doesn't mean that,
To me, the connection that I ran with was all the research that Helene Langevin did around stretching and watching the behavior of fibroblasts in tissue, and how when a needle was inserted and turned, to me, that's sort of like tiny yin yoga happening because
Mm-hmm.
tissue is being pulled and held. That in both of those two situations, fibroblasts, which if you're not aware of that, are the cells that maintain your connective tissue, that help create new collagen. They're kind of like the scaffolding guys. They would have the same behavioral response, which is to broaden and flatten out. And so that, because that behavior was similar, I think was sort of, these things must be
Right.
doing similar things. And if we're looking at theories of piezoelectricity, or if things are stimulated, energy will be created. If both of those examples are doing that, and we've got a quantifiable thing that happens similarly in both of those, then they must be similar. And they're similar, but they're not the same.
Sort of like a navel orange and a grapefruit. Similar, both citrus, don't taste the same, you know. They don't, it's like, yes, there's similarities that you can look at. And I do think a lot of times this is a telephone game thing. I've noticed a few, and when I eventually have Bernie on, I will have a list of all of the questions that I have, because I've heard people misquote him. But I think that sometimes people hear a teacher say something that they're using as like a bit of philosophy or as like a poetic analogy, and they take that to mean literal. Like, if you think yin yoga is a way to care for the sinew channels of our body and our meridians, like acupuncture is, that's a very different statement than yin yoga is the same as acupuncture, or yin yoga has the same effect on our body as acupuncture. And I sometimes wonder with these things if they're not misquoting. I know when I had a teacher training once where I said, and I'm very clear about this, that in a yin yoga practice, we're not using the breath techniques that would be designed to stimulate and to bring the energy up and out the chakras to sort of like get out of the body. And, like that is an Indian concept. And in a yin system, we're actually kind of trying to down regulate the nervous system. We're trying to be embodied. And so we wouldn't be using those pranayama techniques in a yin practice, because it would be confusing to our nervous system to be like, wait, you just jacked me up. Now you're telling me to sit still. Like, what's happening here? So that's what I'd said. What got quoted back to somebody was, Nick said you can't do pranayama in yin class.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why whenever I hear something like this quoted by someone else, it's like, I want to ask them what they meant, because that is not what I said. I just said, we're going to choose our pranayama techniques based on their energetic effects and the intention of this practice. And we're going to marry those together. Like breath of fire and yin, probably not so great, but doing like deep belly breathing or any of these kind of sort of down regulating, soothing breaths for a yin practice, beautiful, So I feel like, yes, as always, the subtleties get left out sometimes. Yeah.
And that's not too dissimilar from somebody grasping a tiny bit of Chinese medicine knowledge and inserting it into a yin class with a real boldness. We take in what we can, we make sense of it with the current systems of learning that we already have, and then we spit it back out in those formats, which is why it's dicey. And we've just got to be really mindful about what went into the system, what came out through our filter, and what audience are we giving that to?
One of the biggest skills that I think came from me taking my trauma training when I did my yoga therapy is that everything becomes invitational. And so we're not making statements. So, for example, even if I think that in 99% of the cases that I have seen of back pain, and I've been working with people with back pain for over 17 years, even if as a yoga therapist who specializes in back pain, I see that like 99% of the time, this is true for most people, there's always outliers, there's always exceptions, there's always nuance. So I would never say, these are the 5 best poses for back pain. Do you see what I mean? It's like, but that's what people are doing with this little TCM information. What I would say instead is, many of us with our sedentary culture and sitting at desks and then doing dishes and vacuuming and all the things where we're rounding forward, and then we're slouching on the couch, that there's a disproportionate amount of that action in our spine. And that most people can benefit from the other actions like gentle back bending, twisting, and lateral extension to improve the health of their spine, right? That's a statement that I can make. But notice I said, generally, most people, right? I didn't say this is the blanket problem for everybody, because it's never that way. And so I try to use, even if I'm introducing a concept, I try to always say, from my experience or from my training or in my own body, I noticed this. You might feel that, or you might feel something different. Let me know. Right. So then always taking myself out of the role of expert of your experience, because you are the expert of your experience. I can give you some nuggets, I can guide you, but ultimately you have to tell me how that fits with you, and does that resonate, and is that working for you, and or is the opposite true? And I think sometimes teachers are uncomfortable with not knowing, and this is why they come with this, like, this is the way, because it's like, nope, I read it in this book, according to so and so, here's a study, and it's like, whoa, okay, but maybe not always. And I think as an experienced teacher, it becomes more and more important. Actually, I think this, I always often say this, when I graduated my first teacher training program, I knew way more about yoga than I do now. Or at least I thought I did. Like I thought, oh yeah, I know how to get people into Warrior 2, because I didn't know anything. I didn't know about skeletal variations. I didn't know about injuries. I knew nothing. The more I study yoga, the longer I teach, the more I help people, the more I realize how much I don't know. And that's totally okay. And that actually if you come to people with, you know what, I'm not sure, I have some theories, but let's try this and let's try that, and you let me know how it goes, and let's see how this works for you. It takes so much of the pressure off of you, because you're not expected to be this like all-knowing God of all things yoga, And it's the same with acupuncture. I'm sure you can say, like, I've gone and where people have, like, they've done certain points and been like, oh, okay, well now we're going to try this instead, because it's a process. First of all, it's always in a process of becoming, because we're not stagnant statues of rock. We're living, breathing, changing, moving beings, and that not everything works for everybody. So for example, a point that is often needled for some of the things that I've struggled with, which we'll keep aside, is do 20. So top of the head, for those of you who do not know that's actually one of the worst points for me. I'm okay with, which one is this one? Front of the hairline. See how long it doesn't take long. But
do 24.
Thank you. I was like, it doesn't 24. Take long before the numbers are not in my mind anymore. That one's fine. Yin tong between I'm fine, but like the top of the head for me, because I have this ability to easily bring energy up, but can't actually release it. It just gives me like a pressure headache. But for most people, apparently that's a brilliant point for them. So again, even professionals who've studied this and practiced this for years are still going to be adaptable. There's no, this is the plan, this is the formula. And I feel like that's, I think, the missing link often with teachers, is they get all this information, and instead of sitting with it, like you said, and just kind of putting it into their own body and their own practice, and then maybe sharing it when appropriate within their own scope of practice with students, but in a curious way, in a like, I learned something, and see how this feels in your body, let me know, is so much more useful than saying like, like so many times I'll see people sharing videos. This is a video for the kidney bladder meridian. And I don't want to be a total asshole, so I don't do this, but I'm so tempted always to write in the comments, and why might we want to do a sequence for our kidney and bladder meridian? Just out of curiosity. Because what happens is, of course, they learn that in their teacher training, and now they want to make their sequences sound more knowledgeable or more fancy or more interesting. And so they just do that without going, what are the benefits of working with the sinew channels of the kidney and bladder meridian? Like, why am I even making this sequence? Which is why, again, I come at it from a seasonal elemental perspective. all of
Mm.
us can use more harmonizing between one season to the next. And there is this gift that nature, if we pay attention, is telling us about how we should move in the world according to what's happening around us with the animals and the seasons and and if we can be open to that and go, oh, okay, so how do I want to transition from winter into spring? Like, what do I need to do in order to make that energetic transition and that heartfelt transition, and with my food and with my movement and my sleep patterns? And I find that that's useful. But anything beyond that to teach my teachers or to guide my students with is, again, it's beyond my scope of practice. And I did study acupuncture for 3 years, y'all, and I'm still not giving people point by point diagnosis and acupressure in my classes because it's not appropriate. Now, what I do have a bit of a gift in, luckily, is when I work with an acupuncturist and we are on part of somebody's healthcare team together, if they share their diagnosis with me, I'll be like, okay, right. I understand the Chinese diagnosis. I can maybe give them a sequence that would support them anatomically based on their injuries and stuff, but also maybe on whatever meridians. Like, if I can see the points, I understand your diagnosis. Now I can maybe give you a sequence custom for you to help support what your acupuncturist is always already doing, but not as a diagnosis, not as a replacement, not as a yeah. So you're at the point of taking this robust training and deciding what's going to stay and what's going to go.
I'm just going to distill it down, even the large theory components, because I am shifting to a week-long immersion. So it's going to be interesting to see how that goes for me. I'm taking out all of the viewed content, unless people want to do that later as a way to upgrade to a 50-hour certification.
Wonderful.
And that's optional for them, and they can take their time. But even just with the time we will have together in person, I need to go over all of my content and go, what are the really important nuggets that are necessary to know? And like, tease those out. What are the things that are interesting and fascinating, but not core foundational knowledge, not for a level 1 training anyway. And I wanted to say, I think it's also reflective of where I am as a practitioner, because what I've been learning with this acupuncturist is everything's based on the pulse. So when you were saying before, I don't know, I no longer go into treatments with clients and intellectualize what they're telling me. I feel the pulse. And sometimes the pulse signature that I'm feeling makes no sense to my brain. I cannot compute how that's the channel that your body is sending a signal out for to be activated today to help balance out what's going on for you. But that's the signal you're giving me. That's what we're going to do. So it's not me making any decisions except for listening, and then using my intuition to decide which points on that channel will activate the channel, rather than the points being the hero. The points having functions was something that really came later in history, but it's the channels that are doing the work, for lack of a better word. So that's been a great process for me, because it's so relieving. Like, I don't have to know, but I do have to be present, and I do have to listen, and I have to be paying attention to what you're offering me. And I need to be really aware of my frequency and my vibration. If I'm in there and I am distracted and placing doubts upon you and your ability to heal, or putting a story on you and your ability to be compliant with dietary advice, you're going to tune into that like two tuning forks. So there's a lot of crossover with what happens in a yin classroom and what happens when you are with a patient. And yeah, it really is moving toward this space of, you don't know. And it's a beautiful thing to not know. You don't have to know.
Yes.
But you do have to be paying attention.
Oh, can you say that once more for the people in the cheap seats?
Yeah. It's not important that you know. You don't have to know. You don't have to have the answer. Like, hallelujah, you don't have the answer. But what is important that you are paying attention and that you're
Mhm.
present to what is unfolding before you, whether you're an acupuncturist or a yin yoga teacher or a human being in
I
any
was just going to
capacity.
say, or just trying to be a kind human,
Just trying to
because
be a kind human.
because empathy only comes from that place of presence, right? You can't be in an empathic connection, and I don't necessarily mean in the way that sometimes um, empathy is discussed, but like you can't be there to witness and hold brave. I like to say the word brave space rather than safe space because I think it's more accurate. Um, to hold brave space for someone in their experience, unless you are coming in with that open listening and that curiosity without these theories that you have. Yeah,
Mm.
beautiful. Well, I
What a
always feel
great
like
conversation.
I know, and I always feel like I should say, kind of near the end of these, dear yoga teacher, if you're hearing this episode and you're feeling called out, if you're going, oh shit, I do that. Oh shit, I've done that. Oh, wait, what? It's not as simple as the lung and grief. Please don't feel called out. What you're listening to is a fireside chat of two yoga professionals who have been teaching for a long time and have also extra healing modalities, who have really given this a ton of thought and heart and what we're witnessing. And instead, if you have kind of found that like a few times you've been like, oh, that's me, just sit with that. Give yourself that same empathy and compassion you would if you were with somebody else, and just go, okay, I've learned that I've been maybe doing things in a naive way, or maybe in an unskillful way, or in an uninformed way. And now I have the opportunity to backpedal, just like you are with your training, and go, okay, but now with this new information, how do I want to move going forward? And so I'm going to give a very simple example before we say our goodbyes. When I studied with Paul Grilly, before I studied with him, I taught Tadasana, stand at the top of your mat, feet together, because that's how I was taught. And then I experienced Paul's teaching on his DVD and was like, not everyone can bring their feet together. Well, that's interesting. And so I started just saying to my students, come to the top of your mat and find a position of feeling strength and grounded. And that was my Tadasana. And I had a student ask me after class, well, you used to tell us to bring our feet together and you're not anymore. Why? And I said, because I've learned that we're not all clones of each other, and that some people can stand comfortably with their feet together and feel grounded and solid. Some people can't stand with their feet together. And some people, when they stand with their feet right together, are going to feel anything but mountain-like, right? They're going to be feeling kind of tippy and like not grounded in their feet. And then if they can just bring their feet a little bit further apart, suddenly they go, okay, here we are. And so I didn't, go to my students and say, by the way, I just learned this. Sorry, I've been screwing this up all these years. I just went into come to the top of your mat. And when they asked, I was like, oh, I've been studying some more and here's what I've learned. Don't be afraid to tell your students that you've learned new information. You don't have to, make a big announcement in your newsletter about it. But if the way that you teach starts to change and someone asks, just say, oh, I've been doing some deeper studies and I now realize there's more layers to this than I thought. And thank goodness for that, because I, for one, as a nerd or a geek, I think probably a geek is more accurate, always want to be learning. Like, I don't ever want to know all the things. I want to be learning all the things. And when it's a quote that my partner often says, I think it's from Dune. Whenever I say, hey, do you know? And he's like, no, I don't know, because knowing prevents the mind from learning. So that's a good little nugget, maybe.
That's great.
I
Yeah.
would love for you to just share where people can find you if they want to,
Sure.
study with you. I know that you are in a process of reimagining everything, so websites and things may be changing, but your website,
Yes.
where you are on the socials. You also have a podcast, which I think is also temporarily paused, at least for now. But please share it all anyways, because people will maybe listen to
Sure.
this way in the future.
Sure. And thank you. That was so beautifully said, Nick. And I'd like to just add to that, that for the listeners, everything we're saying in this conversation truly comes from the heart. And we're sharing it from the vantage point that we have because we're learning. And evolution means that you grow and reflect back and look at what's changed, not with criticism or judgment, but merely to say, hey, here are some things we've observed and learned, and we want to share them so that everybody grows together.
Yeah.
Yes, I am currently going through what I'm calling a digital renovation where I had all my yoga and Chinese medicine together, and I'm realizing they need separate spaces. So for the time being, and there will be easy redirections for the future, but for the time being, um, all of my blogs and all of my online courses are found on my website, which is drkarinasmith.com. And I have a YouTube channel, which is also Dr. Karina Smith, where I've got just a ton of bibs and bobs, yoga things, skeletal variance things, Chinese medicine things, again, all together for now. And I have a podcast, which is the Dr. Karina Smith podcast, where I've had beautiful conversations like we have had today with acupuncturists, yin yogis, my own little musings on yin yoga. And whilst I'm doing this, I'm calling it like a church and state separation moment. Um, I will be coming back to that. But in the meantime, there'll be a couple of extra little bonus episodes coming out on that. And yeah, I'm really excited to get clear on where my offerings sit and being able for those offerings to meet the people that are truly interested in those rather than it all being together.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm about to do Nick's marketing course, which I'm really excited about as well, because it's perfectly timed for me to really get clear on what is it that I'm offering in the yoga space and how does that differ from this space where it's been lots and lots and lots of things trying to do a lot for a lot of people. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they are the places that you can, and I'm on Instagram as well, Dr. Karina Smith.
Can I
That's
just
where you
say
can find me.
from a marketing perspective, and by the way, I do yoga teacher because I don't talk about it a lot on this podcast. I also do yoga business mentorship and I help teachers with business foundation and marketing. I'll put links for that in the show notes. But from a marketing nerdy point of view, I just want to compliment you on the fact that every single thing that you just mentioned was your name and the doctor, Dr. Karina Smith, doctor. Like, there's your free business lesson for the day, dear teachers. Keep it simple, keep it easy to remember, use your name. So easy.
Easy
Oh.
name. They don't have to then figure out what does that mean. Oh, that's her.
Mm-hmm. And it's
It's the name.
simple. If they know your name, they can find you anywhere. They can just put
Yeah.
it into Google and all the things will appear. Yes. Thank you so much for your time. I loved what is the first of hopefully many editions with you and with others of what I'm calling our fireside chats, where they're a little bit more back and forth, conversational, nerding out together. It was lovely. And I'm sure we will end up doing this again at some point. And
I
until
love
then,
that.
I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Nick. This was great. Thanks, everybody.
Bye for now.